Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Sit back and relax, because it's time for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll pick up where we left off with part 2 of chapter 16 of Runnin With The Devil, written by Van Halen's manager, Noel Monk. If you recall, at the end of part 1, Alex made a move on Noel's wife, Jan. So, let's see what happens next. Part 2 is called No More Michael. Here we go. On that same leg of the tour, Jan and I celebrated our first wedding anniversary, April 24th, 1984. We were in Winnipeg, Canada, and had the night off. After a beautiful meal in the lovely hotel restaurant, a cake magically appeared at our table. I never did find out who sent it. Adorned in icing was the message, "Happy First Anniversary, Jan and Noel." It was a very nice gesture, but after a lavish meal and 2 bottles of wine, we had no room left for cake, so we decided to pack it up and take it back to our room. Along the way, we passed several people in our entourage who were hanging out outside their rooms on our floor. Many of them had attended our wedding and now offered congratulations and reminisced about what a great party the wedding had been. A few also reminded Jan that my getting married was one of the all-time great upsets, so obviously she must be something special, which she was and is. Before we went into our room, we stopped to chat with Alex and his new girlfriend, Sherry, whom he had met recently on the road, and who was now traveling with him. She was a beautiful woman, and they seemed rather taken with each other. Jan had spent some time with them backstage, and liked Sherry. But as with most of the women Alex met, she wasn't around long after that evening. Alex was in a good mood that night, not excessively drunk, and was quick to wish us a happy anniversary. He had taken the time to send us some flowers, and it's worth noting that he chose black orchids, sort of like our anniversary was a funeral rather than a celebration. Alex had a perverse sense of humor, so it wasn't much of a surprise. At least he had taken the time to mark the day. Outside our room, we saw Michael Anthony hanging around and shooting the breeze with some people. We invited him to hang out for a while. He was at least as drunk as we were, and we were joking and laughing and having a great time, when Michael saw the vase containing the flowers and seemed curious. "Are those for your anniversary?" Jan nodded. "Who the sends black orchids as an anniversary gift?" "Take a guess," Jan said. Michael laughed. "Alex, right?" We all started laughing about what a sick joke it was, but exactly what you'd expect from Alex. All of a sudden, Jan got up, opened a window, and tossed out the flowers, vase and all. Considering we were on the 8th floor, this was not a great idea. Fortunately, no one was hurt. Michael then spotted the box with the cake in it. "What's that?" he asked. "Our anniversary cake," Jan said. "Want to see it?" "Yeah, sure." "Want to smell the flowers on the cake?" This was an old trick, but Michael was too drunk to notice, and probably too trusting. He leaned over the box, and Jan moved in for the kill, pushing Michael's face down into the cake. As Jan laughed and ran toward the bathroom in retreat, Michael picked up a handful of cake and tossed it at her. For the next 5 minutes, an all-out cake war ensued, until both of them were covered in icing. It was one of the best nights we had on the entire tour. The bigger the tour, the harder it is to control everything. There are simply too many moving parts. This sometimes applied to the crew as well as the band members. Indeed, there were days when everything seemed to be falling apart at once. Like the day I was on the stage, talking with David during sound check, at a venue in the southeast, when my walkie-talkie began to beep. On the other end was Eddie Anderson, talking 100 miles an hour. Eddie rarely displayed much emotion, but now our chief of security was in panic mode, which both surprised and concerned me. "No, you have to come to room 632 at the hotel. We have a real problem." "I'm just working with David on a few things," I responded. "I'll be up in a while." "No, you have to come right now," he insisted. "It can't wait. The police are here and they're going to arrest 2 of our roadies from the lighting crew." "What? Slow down, Eddie. What happened?" "Just get over here," he repeated. "Now." I turned off the radio and headed for the stage exit. I could hear David say, "What the?" as I left, but this was not the time to placate him. I ran to the hotel, jumped into the elevator, and punched the 6th floor. At the far end of the hall, I could see Eddie pacing back and forth. When I got to him, I was shocked to see that he was actually sweating. "Okay, spit it out," I said. Eddie shook his head. "The best way to explain this is to show you." With that, he opened the door. I was met with a strong smell of marijuana. I quickly glanced around the room, and I could barely believe my eyes. There were 2 uniformed police officers standing with 2 roadies whom I barely knew. That's how big our crew had gotten. Both of them had stupid, eating grins on their faces. The room was completely trashed. Lamps on the floor, tables turned upside down, televisions ripped out of the wall. It was a fine example of hotel trashing. I almost wanted to congratulate them, if not for one small thing. As I took 2 steps into the room, I slipped on a piece of paper and wound up on my butt, staring at the ceiling. All around me were other pieces of paper, which I recognized as pages that had been ripped from a book. I picked up one of the pages and looked at it. Instantly, I realized the problem. The pages had been torn from a Bible. "Are you out of your minds?" I said to the roadies, who suddenly stopped smiling. "You can't tear up a Bible." Especially in the South, where folks tend to take these matters rather seriously. "Are you ready to arrest them?" I asked the officers. One of the officers nodded grimly. "You got that right." "Well, I'm the manager of Van Halen, and these pieces are my responsibility. Do you think I could talk to you in the hall for a moment?" Once outside, I apologized profusely on behalf of the entire organization, and then asked the cops for permission to handle the situation internally. "I think my solution will be harsher than what you might do," I said. "They will be fired immediately. We'll drop them off at the bus station and give them just enough money to pay for a ticket home. Getting any work in the future in this business will be almost impossible." I paused to gauge the reaction of the officers. They wanted to hear more. "And obviously, we will pay for all the damages, and then we will charge it back to these 2 holes." "Okay," one of the cops said. "You do that, and they are all yours." I went back into the hotel room and ordered the roadies to begin cleaning up the mess. "And forget about the crew meal," I said. "You're going to work the show tonight, but you can do it on an empty stomach, and then you're gone." Patrick, our production manager, made sure everyone knew what had happened. 2 hours later, I went down to the crew meal to see how everyone would react. To my surprise, I got a round of applause. They understood. There is a line you don't cross, and these guys had crossed it. They had to go. The whining was driving me crazy. Edward whining about David. David whining about Edward and Alex. Alex whining about Michael, of all people. Michael, well, he didn't whine about anything or anyone. To the very end, he remained grateful for the gift that was Van Halen. Maybe it was his natural personality, or Maybe he was simply capable of greater perspective than everyone else. Maybe he wasn't quite as addled by drugs and alcohol. For whatever reason, Michael stayed on the sidelines as the rest of the band fought like a pack of starving wolves who have come across a carcass in the wilderness. Previous tours, especially in the first couple of years, had always featured a fair amount of ball busting and the occasional argument that was required simply to clear the air. For the most part, though, we had a blast on the road. It was a non-stop party punctuated by spectacularly energetic concerts. There had been a lightness to it all, a sense of being part of something special and of wanting to enjoy every minute. But now, the levity was gone. Even though they had spent hardly any time together offstage, the boys were at each other's throats constantly, either directly or through a conduit, usually me. Two more quick stories, both involving Al. We were all sitting outside by the hotel pool one day. A guy named Mike had been flown in for a couple days to take care of the boys' grooming needs. Mike was a hairdresser, or stylist, or whatever you want to call him. Point is, he was really good at his job. An artistic young man with a good sense of humor and the patience to deal with a bunch of egotistical rock stars. On this particular day, as he fussed over a grumpy Alex, Mike decided to lighten the mood by giving Al a little kiss. Now, I have no idea whether Mike was straight or not, and it doesn't really matter in the least. The point is, Al took this humorous gesture as an affront to his manhood and got seriously pissed off. He didn't try to hurt Mike or anything, but he did go on a rant that was far out of proportion to what had happened. "I don't ever want that working here again," he screamed at one point. Poor Mike was scared, bewildered, and disappointed. He liked Al. He liked all the guys in Van Halen. He simply hadn't realized that the band had mostly lost its collective sense of humor. Another story. Another hotel, midway through the tour on the night of a show. What city? I don't know. Doesn't really matter. Could have been anywhere. In a throwback to earlier and more innocent times, David decided to play a practical joke on Alex. Actually, it wasn't much of a joke, and it required little ingenuity. It was more a case of David just with his bandmate by inserting the nozzle of a fire extinguisher under his door and setting it off. The ensuing noise and accompanying blizzard of white powder provoked a response from Alex that was probably a bit more heated than David had anticipated. Or maybe it was exactly the response he expected and hoped for. Regardless, when I heard the commotion in the hallway, I left my room, and what I saw was at once comical and pathetic. There was Alex, naked. I presume he had a girl in his room, screaming at David, promising to rip his head off, and David laughing in response. Between them, trying to de-escalate the situation, was Eddie Anderson, our chief of security and David's personal bodyguard. "I'm gonna kill you, David!" Al kept screaming. Emboldened by Eddie Anderson's presence, David would press forward, laugh a little, then toss off a threat in response. "I'll kick your butt, Al. You're up." But he didn't mean it. David was not a tough guy. He was all show. This was a man who once signed up for karate lessons and paid in advance for enough schooling to take him all the way through to a black belt, but I doubt that he went more than a few times. He liked to fashion himself as something of a martial artist, but it was all style and no substance. The best example of this? After a show at Madison Square Garden in New York, someone tried to break into the luggage compartment of our bus. We caught the guy, a skinny little Hispanic kid, must have weighed 95 pounds, before he could get away, and he wound up hiding under the back of the bus. David found out what was happening, and instead of letting security take care of the matter, decided to play the role of enforcer. "I'll handle it," he said. So, holding onto the back bumper, he slid beneath the rear of the bus and tried to kick at the poor kid, while the rest of us stood around watching. We let this go on for about 10 minutes, until David became exhausted and pulled himself out from under the bus, his chest heaving, his legs covered with dirt. After he walked away, we coaxed the kid out. He was just a street kid, obviously poor and maybe homeless, so it was hard not to pity him. "Don't be stupid," I told the kid. "Next time we'll send someone after you who knows what they're doing, and you might get hurt. Understand?" The kid nodded, and we sent him on his way. So that was David. In a physical matchup against Alex Van Halen, he was the decided underdog. And he knew it. Had Eddie Anderson not been there to intervene, David would have been in serious trouble. Instead, with Eddie holding Alex at bay, David was able to scramble safely back to his room, shouting, "You, Al!" as he slammed the door. "You, David!" Al responded before disappearing into his room. I looked at Eddie, who merely shrugged and walked away. He might have been thinking the same thing that I was thinking. In 1978, or even in 1982, spraying a fire extinguisher under a hotel door would have been viewed as an offense so minor it might have gone unnoticed. But now, in the middle of the biggest and most expensive tour in the history of Van Halen, it was apparently a crime punishable by death. As the door of my room closed behind me and I staggered back to bed, all I could think was, man, these guys hate each other. On the 1984 tour, there were two parts of the day that I grew to dread: sound check and the post-concert meal. David ruled both of these events in a bilious and petulant manner, ordering everyone around during sound check and then pointing out every little mistake after the show. Granted, he had long used these situations as a forum for flexing his muscles as the de facto band leader. But drug and alcohol use, combined with the Van Halen brothers' growing resistance to David's dictatorial preening, made for a much more hostile environment all the way around. Being a natural bully, David began focusing his harangues less on Edward and Alex and more on Michael. But the saddest part to me was that neither Alex nor Edward would stick up for Michael. It was like Lord of the Flies. The weak were destined to be destroyed. Still, what happened one night, roughly halfway through the tour, caught me completely by surprise. Not just because of the extent of the meanness, but because of what it foreshadowed. We were gathered in a hospitality suite, loading plates with food from a buffet table, while David did his usual critique. I had learned to tune him out by this point, and in fact, often just left the room altogether. But on this night, I was there for every word of David's post-mortem, and for Edward's sudden and unexpected interjection. When he began to speak, I thought for sure that he would lash out at David, but he didn't. Instead, he began taking shots at Michael, and not just about his performance on stage, but about his role in the band. "Michael doesn't contribute as much as the rest of us," Edward observed. "Michael doesn't write music or lyrics." He might as well have said that Michael was just taking up space, and that his role could be fulfilled by virtually anyone. Now, this may or may not have been a valid point. Michael was not a songwriter, and thus contributed little to Van Halen from a composing standpoint. But the same could be said of Alex. Edward and David had always done most of the writing, and everyone was fine with this arrangement. Songwriting credits notwithstanding, royalties were split evenly among the band members. For some reason, Edward now felt compelled to challenge that arrangement. "Why does Michael get the same share as the rest of us?" Edward asked, and as he said this, he looked at me, like I had anything to do with an arrangement that predated my arrival, and that supposedly was based on friendship and egalitarianism. I had no answer for this. Frankly, I had no idea what was going on, or why suddenly everyone seemed to be ganging up on the one member of the band who meant no ill will toward anyone. Al jumped in behind Edward, asking the same sorts of questions and offering similar observations about Michael's value, or lack thereof, to the band. For the most part, Michael just sat there quietly and took it, until David stood up from his seat, a plate of food in his hand, and walked around the table. He stopped when he reached Michael's seat and stood over him for a moment, glaring menacingly, but saying nothing. The entire scene reminded me of a junior high school cafeteria, with the cool kids picking on the shy and sensitive. My hope was that Michael would stand up for himself, but he didn't. He just sat there with David standing over him, until finally David exploded in a manner that was extreme, even by his lofty standards. Without saying a word, David slammed his full plate of food down on top of Michael's full plate. The effect was startling. Food went flying everywhere. Glasses tipped over and shattered. Silverware fell to the floor. And all conversation stopped. We all stared at Michael and awaited his reaction. This is it, I thought. Here is the moment the quiet kid fights back. But he didn't. Instead, he simply pushed his chair back from the table and stood up. He lightly brushed at some of the food stains on his shirt, gave David a hard stare, and walked out of the room. That was the end of it, until 2 weeks later, when Alex, Edward, and David all came to my room, without Michael. "What's up, guys?" I asked. Al was the first to speak, but it was clear they were united in purpose. "We have a problem with Michael," he said. "How can you have a problem with Michael?" I said. "He's the nicest guy on earth." No one disagreed with that sentiment. They also claimed it was beside the point. This wasn't a popularity contest. The criticisms leveled at Michael the night David destroyed his meal had apparently intensified. No longer were Alex, Edward, and David content to merely complain about Michael's contributions. Now, they wanted to take action. Severe, punitive, life-changing action. "We want to cut Michael out of the royalties," Alex said. "You mean in the future?" I asked. "No," they explained. "Not just moving forward, but for 1984 as well." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. First of all, this was an incredibly cold and callous thing to do to someone who had been with your band all along. Second, Michael had a contract with the band that covered the current album, which, by the way, had already sold a couple million copies. I tried to explain this to the guys, but they were adamant about changing the parameters of the band's structure, effective not just immediately, but backdated to a point prior to the release of 1984. "Fix it, Noel," David said. "Call the lawyer, have him draw something up, and we'll get Michael to sign it." "Guys," I said, "are you sure about this?" I couldn't imagine that Michael would go along with a contract modification that could cost him millions of dollars. Moreover, I couldn't believe that they really wanted to hurt Michael so deeply and irrevocably. It was an unconscionable thing to do to another human being, especially one with whom you had worked and lived and strived with for the better part of a decade. But they all nodded in agreement. "Just do it," David said. You might wonder why I didn't protest louder, or why I didn't counsel Michael about how he could have protected himself. But remember, I was in a unique and highly challenging position. I was the manager of Van Halen. I worked for the band, and 3 members of the band were now unified in their decision to push the 4th member to the very fringes of the organization. Moreover, while I liked Michael, the truth is, He was the one member of the organization who rarely came to me with any of his problems. Granted, that might have been because he was more emotionally mature and generally happier in his personal and professional life than the other guys. Michael had a degree of contentment that the other guys simply did not enjoy. So while our relationship was cordial and professional, it would be inaccurate to say that we were close. My wife did not go shopping with Michael the way she did with Al. Michael did not come into my room late at night and curl up onto my lap the way Edward did. And I did not spend endless hours discussing promotion and marketing with Michael the way I did with David. Michael was just there. Quiet, dependable, unassuming. In the end, this proved to be his undoing. Within another week or so, a letter had been drafted by the band's attorney. As with most legal documents, it was cold and clinical, devoid of the feelings that such a grievous emotional betrayal signifies. It read as follows: Dear Michael Anthony, you and the members of Van Halen have reevaluated the writing and composing services and contributions of each member of the Van Halen group on behalf of Van Halen as a company, a corporation. As a result of such reevaluation, you and the undersigned have agreed that in respect to musical compositions embodied in the record album entitled 1984, and with respect to musical compositions embodied in any subsequent recordings performed by Van Halen thereafter, you shall not be entitled to share in the publisher's share of revenues derived from the 1984 compositions or subsequent compositions, nor will you be able to participate or share as a writer in any of the revenues derived from the writer's share of revenues from the 1984 compositions. Accordingly, for good and invaluable considerations, receipt of which is hereby acknowledged, the parties agree. If Michael had come to me with that piece of paper, which was basically a contract addendum that would completely change the course of his life, and asked me my opinion, I would have told him in no uncertain terms, tear it up, tell them to go themselves. You don't deserve to be treated like this. But Michael did not come to me. He did not share with me his opinion on any of this. He simply did what he was told by the other guys in the band. He signed the paper, as did David, Alex, and Edward. From that moment on, Michael was basically a wage earner, as opposed to a partner in the corporation. The largest part of his income was now derived from merchandising, and while this was not an insignificant amount, it paled in comparison to what the others were making. Think about it. Michael went on stage every night and played to the best of his ability. He was a founding member of Van Halen, currently one of the biggest bands in the world, and yet he was treated like a disposable piece of the machinery. It was bad enough that they were cutting him out of future revenue, but to rewrite the contract in such a way that he would not even share in royalties from the biggest album the band would ever produce, when that album was already out in the marketplace? Utterly cruel. I can't imagine how Michael was able to stand up there on stage every night, smiling and playing bass in his customary carefree manner, as if everything was right with the world, when in fact he had been stabbed in the back by the very people to whom he was closest, the people he should have been able to trust with his life and his livelihood. They had turned on him, and in so doing, it seemed they had broken not just his spirit, but the spirit of Van Halen as well. Well, that wraps up Chapter 16. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 16 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.